So this is our Simondon reading group, continuing our reading of Individuation in Light of Notions of Form and Information, Volume 2. We're on the very long text, History of the Notion of the Individual. We'll be on that text for a while. We're still in ancient Greece in terms of the historical progression that we're going through. And last time we looked mostly at Aristotle, and with some sort of callbacks to Plato in that text. So we looked at the Aristotelian physics, which is sort of oriented around the notion of a place. So entities occupy a place. There's no such thing as a void in Aristotelian physics. So every entity is surrounded by other entities of various kinds or other substances. And there's this notion of the unmoved mover, which Aristotle identifies with God, this thought thinking itself. And this is sort of responsible for the movement of the rest of the universe. Everything else is moved by the interaction or the attraction towards this unmoved mover. And anyways, we don't need to go through all the details of the Aristotelian physics, but there's essentially like a whole system of physics that sort of explains everything that goes on in the universe in terms of the orientation of entities towards a goal. There's a finality or a teleology built into Aristotelian physics. One key point that we saw towards the end of last week was this, what I would call a sort of dialectical reversal, though Simondon doesn't use this term, but this sort of paradoxical reversal that happens between Plato and Aristotle, where Plato starts with the notion of an individual as being something that is oriented towards something outside of itself. It's the individual is oriented towards the good or the realm of the forms in general, and has this sort of openness to it. But precisely this openness brings about in the bigger picture, or like the longer scale, in the Platonic theory, it brings about a kind of self-containedness of the individual. So the individual has a coherent biography, in a sense, even going beyond the lifespan of a person. So the soul survives after death and is reincarnated into a new body, and sort of continues its journey. And there's this sort of coherent progression of the soul from one life to another. So this, starting from this notion of the individual as something open to something external, leads to this notion of the individual as something sort of coherent and self-contained. And then on the other hand, with Aristotle, he starts with the notion of the individual as a self-contained substance, as something that is that doesn't inhere in anything else, that is a sort of independent entity. And then his account of that individual ends up leading towards this relationship with the unmoved mover. And in particular, in the case of the human individual, there's this notion of the agent intellect. So there's something, when we think, we are always brought into movement or solicited into the movement of thinking through something that is already actively thinking, or through something actual, because movement is always a movement from the potential to the actual that is brought about by something actual. So there has to be this agent intellect, which is always actual, and brings about the motion of the passive intellect. And what exactly the relationship is between this agent intellect or active intellect and the passive intellect, or the rest of the human soul, is a contentious point in Aristotle scholarship. But there's at least some sort of openness of the human individual to this agent intellect, which is not exactly contained within the individual. So Aristotle starts from this notion of a self-contained or self-subsistent individual and ends up with this notion of the individual as being open to something outside of itself. And so we see that Plato and Aristotle sort of switch places where they started one with the notion of an open individual and end up with the notion of this coherent biography. And then Aristotle starts with the notion of a self-contained individual and ends up with this notion of an open uh, individual or an individual open to what's outside of it. And so this sort of dialectical reversal that Simondon identifies, he sees this as being characteristic of this attempt to understand the individual in light of the order of simultaneity. And so both Aristotle and Plato try to understand what an individual is in terms of some sort of essence or some sort of uh, set of properties that an individual has at a given time. Um, and then he sort of in a transition to today's reading, he talks about how later Greek authors try to understand the individual in terms of becoming rather than being, or the order of succession rather than the order of simultaneity. Um, and so we'll see what that means more today. But another interesting point, just before we begin with today's reading, is that Simondon sort of gives a kind of historical sociological explanation of why there's this transition within ancient Greek thinking. He suggests that uh, the way that some of the ancient city states start to become incorporated into empires or to be conquered, and there's this period of warfare and instability in the ancient Greek worlds where the individual is now sort of more stable than the social order, where you can grow up in a city and then have that city be conquered and have to move to a different city and found new cities and so on. The social order is more transitory and less stable than the order at the level of the individual. And so this sort of instability is seen as a sort of motive for understanding the individual as something that is maintained through time or through becoming, rather than something that is defined in the order of simultaneity. So we're going to pass today to the second phase, that phase of becoming in the sort of Hellenistic or late period of ancient Greek philosophy, which doesn't get as much study as sort of the classical period of Plato and Aristotle, but we'll see a few, sort of a quick overview of some of the different schools that were around at that time. Yeah, Angus, you can go ahead.
Okay, starting at the Socratics. The two great dogmatic schools founded after the death of Alexander the Great, Epicureanism and Stoicism, were preceded by the Socratic schools, which have prepared their doctrine and reveal a certain number of characteristics that announce a new thought. Already from the outside, there is a palpable difference between the Platonic Aristotelian attitude and that of the Socratics. The schools of Plato and Aristotle are not just gatherings of individuals, but juridically recognized religious associations that are capable of having a foundation and surviving afterwards. Conversely, the Socratic schools are simple gatherings of individual listeners who revolve around a teacher whom they pay. The preoccupation is directly practical, whereas Plato requires a long propedeutic. Antisthenes and Aristippus turn their disciples away from astronomy or music, which are considered useless because they do not speak of goods or ills. The appeal to direct and personal impression replaces reasoning and dialectics. The individual, with his immediate impressions and his preferences, is made into the judge of a truth that directly interests his tendencies and preoccupations. Reflective elaboration is considered something artificial. The political question disappears from this teaching. I'll read some of the Megarian one too. The Megarians. The Megarian school seeks to establish the impossibility of participation. For Euclid of Megara, concepts can only be joined together if they're identical and can only be distinguished if they exclude one another. The good is a single thing, whether it be called by different names, science, God, intelligence, or still other names. These terms were the ones that Plato and the Timaeus sought to join together through hierarchization and to distinguish by putting them into relation. According to Euclid of Megara, there is nothing similar that is neither identical nor different. The analogical and paradigmatic method is therefore unfeasible. And yet, Plato used this method for knowledge of the individual structure, particularly when he attempted to grasp the relation between reflected intelligence, anger, and the concupiscent appetites in the individual by means of the relation that exists in the city between the class of philosopher magistrates, the class of warriors, and the class of artisans and peasants. Analogy supposes the reality of an order of simultaneity, wherein relation is real and stable. Eubulides of Miletus, Aristotle's successor, on the contrary, is hostile to Aristotle's thought, above all to the principle of contradiction. All the sophisms Diogenes Laertius ascribes to Eubulides consist in taking an individual being and showing that the principle of contradiction applied to the judgments that can be formed about this individual leads to logical impasses. The sophism of the liar is exactly like this. If you say that you are lying and you speak truthfully, then you are lying. This sophism presents a remarkable theoretical interest. Indeed, it is not merely a specious reasoning that would put a philosophy of the concept in an awkward position. It shows that the activity of the individual being reacting on itself and taking itself as the object of its own affirmation leads to a mode of being that is not a stable state, but a self-sustained oscillation between two poles that are the active negation of one another, and therefore negate themselves insofar as they affirm themselves. Only an active individual being expressing itself in an indefinite sequence of definite states can be the agent and theater of such a logical phenomenon.
Yeah, we can stop here because then we get past to the next sophism after that. Yeah, so this material, so he's talking here about what he calls the Socratic schools. So these are schools, different schools of philosophy that appear after Socrates and are inspired by Socrates in various ways, but they're different from the Platonic and Aristotelian schools in that they aren't sort of official institutions. Um, so both Plato and Aristotle found these schools that are like official institutions that continue after the death of their founders and have a sort of established structure, whereas these Socratic schools are much less formal. So they are sort of circles of students around a particular teacher, but they don't have this sort of institutional structure. And so a lot of the source of what Simondon is talking about here in these sections is Diogenes Laertius, who was a sort of historian of philosophy who, in a lot of ways, is not very good. Like he sort of he just sort of copies uh, like summaries from other people and he doesn't really show a lot of understanding of particular philosophical theses, and he just sort of records like the unusual things that this particular philosopher was known for saying. And But unfortunately, this book is one of the main records that survives of a lot of the um, philosophical schools, especially of this era, of the Hellenistic era. Um, so this is one of the main sources that we have to use for studying ancient philosophy. And So the Megarians here, they have to do with some of these what are recognized now as sophisms. So they're arguments that are not valid, but sometimes recognizing why they aren't valid is a bit tricky. So in the case of the liar argument or the liar paradox, like this is a sort of open issue in various logical systems of how to either assign the truth value to a liar sentence or to deny that it has a truth value, or how exactly to handle these sentences is something that is still an open question in various logical systems. One other point is when he mentions Euclid of Megara, we should make sure we distinguish this Euclid from the Euclid who does geometry, who is also mentioned a little bit later. So there are two different people, just happen to have the same name, and we shouldn't confuse the two. And then another point that is of interest here is what Simondon's analysis of the liar paradox that is sort of mentioned here in passing and not really developed in a lot of detail, but he's arguing here that what the liar paradox or these liar sentences, what they demonstrate is that an individual, a human being who has the capacity to sort of entertain the thought of the liar sentence has this sort of self-referential structure, or what he calls here a self-sustained oscillation. So when you entertain the thought of the liar sentence, you sort of pass back and forth from considering the sentence to be true, and if it's true, then it's false, and then you consider the sentence to be false, but if it's false, then it's true. And so you sort of oscillate back and forth between these two poles of considering the sentence to be true and considering the sentence to be false. And it's this oscillation that this sort of circular or feedback character of the thought of the liar sentence that Simondon takes to be something that is characteristic of an individual being. So it's only a being that has individuality in this sort of thick sense that Simondon wants to use that term. So something that that has this sort of internal resonance and this structure of individuality that is capable of having the thought of the liar sentence. So that's just sort of in passing, but he doesn't really develop that idea any further. But I thought that was an interesting analysis of the liar sentence. Okay, so let's go on to the Sororites Paradox. So if someone else would like to read from This Is Also the Difficulty.
Yeah, I can go. This is also the difficulty of limiting a composite, a difficulty that forms the basis of the very important argument known as the Sororites Paradox. A heap of wheat still remains a heap when a grain is removed from it. If one removes from a heap all the grains that constitute it except one, this single grain is both a heap, insofar it is a residue of the heap, and a single grain in itself. This argument was very well known for the Romans. Horace indicates it in his epistles with the expression ratio ruentis acervi, the steady principle of the sinking heap. The argument of the bald man is founded on the same schema as that of the Sororites. A man who loses a single hair is not a bald man, but if this process continues progressively, the man who no longer has but a single hair is not bald insofar as this hair is still his hairstyle, and he is bald because a man who has merely a single hair is bald. This is indeed still the same argument, which consists in all its forms in considering an ensemble as absolutely reducible to the sum of its parts. The hairstyle is reducible to the sum of all the individual hairs, just as the heap is reducible to the sum of all the grains of wheat, the sorrows. No unity of the ensemble qua ensemble, whether it be that of a form or a separate idea, constitutes the basis of the object's identity. This is why one can be made to accept in an illusory way by the adversary that it is possible to remove a grain from a heap and a hair from a hairstyle without modifying them. This is where these arguments are in fact specious. If the reality of a heap of wheat or of a hairstyle only consists in the addition of elements, the subtraction of an element modifies the reality of the ensemble. If, on the contrary, there is a veritable unity of the ensemble, the subtraction of an element does not modify the nature of the ensemble. There is sophistry because the meaning of heap or hairstyle is not univocal in reasoning, and because we pass from the ensemble as organic unity to the ensemble as composite, reducible to the sum of its parts. The sophisms of the Megarians suppose an intellectual method that seeks to isolate the parts from a whole in order to stop only at the individuality of the parts, by refusing to recognize a definite reality constituting the composite qua composite. It makes sense why the Stoics were very annoyed with the Sororites and were led to declare it vitiosum et captiosum genus, lubricum et periculosum locum, a vicious and deceitful kind, a lewd and dangerous place.
Right. So this is another famous paradox, the Sororites Paradox, which the argument, like the name comes from the word soros for a heap. So you have a heap of grain. You remove one grain, and the heap is still a heap. You remove another grain, it's still a heap. You keep removing one grain at a time until you're left with just one grain. And so that one grain has to still be a heap. But of course, a single grain is not a heap. And so you have this contradiction. And this same type of argument can apply to any sort of any word that describes a sort of collective entity like a heap, or the translation here uses the word hairstyle, which is not exactly right, but I don't know a better one. But sort of the collection of hair of a person's hair, likewise, is made up of individual hairs, but and removing one hair doesn't affect the fact that a person is not bald. But then if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, eventually you're left with someone who has only one hair, and that person is bald. So Simondon's analysis of this, what he calls the sophism, is that it involves an equivocation between two different meanings of these collective terms. So on the one hand, you consider the term heap, or whatever the collective is, insofar as it is just composed of its components. So the heap is just the sum of each individual grain. And then on the other hand, you consider the heap to be something that has a sort of unity to it. It's something that is not just the sum of its parts. And the argument sort of passes from one meaning to the other. So if you are treating the heap as just the sum of its parts, then removing one grain from the heap actually does change it. It's no longer the same heap. It's a different heap that has one fewer grain in it. Whereas when in the argument you say that removing one grain from a heap doesn't change the heap, you're passing to the meaning of heap as something that has a certain unity to it. So this is one sort of analysis of why this argument is a sophism, why it's not a valid argument. But I know that this is also a sort of open problem that people discuss various ways of trying to solve this, and it has to do with what we can call vague predicates or vague terms. So something like a heap, to qualify something as a heap, is a vague term because there's no sort of definite boundary of what is a heap and what is not a heap, and so that's what allows us to sort of pass from one meaning of the term to the other. And one last bit, an explanation of this, the Stoic quote here, the quote from the Stoics, where this Sororites is described as being a vicious and deceitful kind, a lewd and dangerous place. The lewdness has to do with another version of this Sororites paradox, which was that incest is not can't be a sin, because if you touch your mother's big toe with your little finger, that's not a sin. And then if you sort of continue to progress one step further at a time, it's not a sin. And then from there you get to incest, and so incest can't be a sin. So this is the type of argument that they consider to be lewd. So I think in general, the sophisms that we've seen, and we'll look at a couple other ones. These sort of the Megarian school, they tend to sort of take one sort of idea of this of a concept. They take one concept and kind of apply it to uh, they apply it and sort of take its consequences like as far as you can, rather than sort of uh, um, taking an idea and trying to understand it in relation to other concepts. There's a sort of one-sidedness, I guess, that you want to hold on to this one concept, whatever the consequences are, and sort of draw those extreme consequences no matter what. Okay, so let's continue. If someone else would like to read.
I can read again. Where did we leave off exactly?
So we're at Stilpo of Megara shows.
Okay. Stilpo of Megara shows that no concept can characterize an individual being. The ideal man is not such or such, for example, speaking and not speaking. The man who speaks, stops, and speaks again is not man. The ideal vegetable is eternal, however, this living vegetable here did not exist 1,000 years ago. In all these reasonings, the characteristics of the change in aspects based on the temporal succession of the individual states and acts introduce contradictory aspects with respect to the identity of a concept that is applicable to several individuals. The ideal man cannot account for the fact that this man here speaks at this moment. And the ideal vegetable cannot account for the fact that this particular vegetable has just grown. According to Stilpo, predication is impossible if we want to think not via individuals but via definite and stable categories. To affirm that the horse runs or that the man is good is to affirm that the horse or the man are something other than themselves. On the other hand, if one responds that the good is effectively the same as man, this is to be prohibited the right to affirm the good of the remedy or of food. In this sense, what must be suppressed are realities like potency in Aristotle or non-being, which Plato accepts as existing, i.e. realities that would make it possible to account for becoming while retaining the fixity of the essences. Dynamism, the power of changing, is internal to the individual being and characterizes it by excluding all determination from a fixed essence. By way of the so-called master argument, Diodorus Cronus wants to exclude the notion of potency from philosophical thought. The affirmation of the possible is incompatible with the principle of contradiction. Indeed, if it is admitted that every proposition is true or false, the principle is valid for future events as well as for the past. There's consequently no indetermination, no possibility of being or not being for the future event. The possible is interior to the individual, which is consequently no longer submitted to the principle of contradiction because it lives and develops in time. The master argument consists in forcing a philosophy of the order of simultaneity to account for an order of succession, which is something that puts it into self-contradiction. Epictetus gives a very complex and elaborate form to this argumentation, which shows how much importance this argument had to have for the philosophers of this era. This is because the Kureon Logos, master argument, provides a vision of being that considers it according to becoming and not according to its integration into the order of simultaneity. In the domain of ethics, the opposition of the Megarians to Plato and Aristotle is quite clear. The individual is cultivated for himself and considered a being to be constructed, to be fashioned. He is one who becomes, and consequently, one who must be guided, educated, leaving aside scientific education, which gives knowledge to the being. Alexinus of Elis, in his treatise on education, takes the side of formal education, which teaches themes and provides know-how, savoir-faire, instead of knowledge, which is savoir. Knowledge integrates the individual into the order of things that he cognizes. Know-how, by allowing him in discussions to triumph over the plausible, gives him the capacity to succeed through various political changes. It turns him into an individual being who is confident in his means.
Right. So here we have some more sophisms or more arguments that the Megarian school uses. So these ones have to do with predication and the impossibility of predication. So when you say something like man is good, if you treat this is as the is of equality, then you're saying that man and good are identical; they're equal terms, and then in that case, if man and good are identical, then you can't say that this food is good or this medicine is good or whatever. Um, you because those terms are not equal to man. Um, or on the other hand, if you say man is good and man and good are not equal, then you're asserting that two things that are not equal are the same, and so you're stating something false. Um, so predication is impossible either whether or not you treat the two components of the predication as identical. Either way, you end up with a contradiction. Um, and of course, this whole argument rests on the identification of predication and equality. So if you assume that predication is a kind of equality between the subject and the predicate, then you end up with these contradictions. But of course, you just don't need to assume that. You can um, uh, understand predication as something distinct from identification of the subject and the predicate. So all of these arguments are related to this sophism, and so like um, for example, the one having to do with the man speaking. So if you say that man speaks, then when an individual person stops speaking, then they stop being a man or a human being. Or if you say that man does not speak, then as soon as someone speaks, then then that person stops being a man. Um, so whether or not you say that man speaks, you end up with a person sort of stopping being a man or beginning to be a man, depending on whether or not they speak. And then there's this discussion of what's called the master argument. So this has to do with this is something that Aristotle already talked about as well. The question of future contingents. So these are propositions about a future event. So there will be a sea battle tomorrow. So these propositions are either true or not true. Like any proposition, so any proposition is either true or not true. Um, and if there will be a sea battle is true tomorrow, if the proposition there will be a sea battle tomorrow is true, then it's necessarily true that it's true now, right? So something that happened in the past is necessarily true. So there's a sort of it starts to become difficult to understand what we can mean by saying that something in the future is contingent. So if there will be a sea battle tomorrow is something that is contingent. If it's not determined yet whether or not that proposition is true, then that contingency sort of travels backwards in time in a sense. So when we talk about it now, it's not there's no determinate truth value of that sentence. That's how Aristotle understands it. That future contingent sentences have no determinate truth value until the time that they talk about actually happens. But for the Megarian school, what instead these types of sentences show is that there's actually no such thing as contingency. So when we say that there will be a sea battle tomorrow, that sentence is either true or false now, just we don't know which one. And eventually we'll determine, we'll be able to find out, tomorrow when we can see whether or not there's a sea battle happening. Then we can determine whether or not it's true or false. So there's always a determinate truth value to that sentence, which means that there never was a time when the opposite sentence or the negation of that sentence was possible. It was always the sea battle was always going to happen, whatever we might know about what events were going to happen in the future. And so Simondon's analysis of this argument is that there's a sort of the reason why this master argument sort of is not very convincing, or why it doesn't seem sufficient to sort of eliminate the idea of contingency, is that it's sort of forcing a logic of succession into a logic of simultaneity. So it's taking a process of becoming something that occurs through time and sort of like collapsing it down into one moment, or one sort of order of succession, order of simultaneity. And so if you sort of collapse the whole order of becoming into simultaneity, then of course you lose the becoming aspect, the contingency of becoming, and then everything appears to be necessary. But you don't have to do that. Essentially, you don't have to account for becoming within the order of simultaneity. You can actually recognize an order of succession instead. And then the last bit here has to do with the focus on ethics that we see in the Megarians. So these sort of logical paradoxes are famous, but the core of the Megarian teaching was that the core of the teaching was an ethical teaching. So the use of these logical paradoxes was essentially to argue that conceptual logical thinking was sort of not possible or not relevant to real ethical life. So the types of sort of system building that Plato and Aristotle do are not worthwhile endeavors, and we should instead focus on ethical life. And in particular, they have this understanding of education. So this is the translation of the Greek term paideia. So it doesn't just mean learning a bunch of facts at school. It means sort of cultivating an individual into their individuality. So bringing a child into the sort of full capacity of being an individual. That's sort of the sense of paideia. And so this Alexinus of Elis argues that we should focus on know-how as opposed to knowledge, and know-how gives you the capacity to win arguments, as opposed to knowledge, which is sort of irrelevant to practical life. And so we should focus on how to win arguments as opposed to trying to use logic to discover the truth, because we just end up with these paradoxes if we try to do that. Okay, so let's go on to the Cynics. I can read a page or so. Okay, the Cynics. The great importance of paideia in the formation of the individual is also found in the Cynics. According to these philosophers, man can be formed and transformed according to rational methods. Menippus, a 3rd century Cynic, recounts in his Sale of Diogenes that Diogenes, who was being sold on the slave market, responded to the buyers who asked him what he could do: command men. The individual is the object of an inner reform that becomes an example to the outside. The Cynic reforms himself and becomes a model, sometimes shown ostentatiously to tyrants themselves who are reproached for their insatiable desires. The individual is denuded of his social dross and uproots himself from any regular society, going from city to city, sleeping in his monk's robe. The Cynics bragged about belonging to the state of Pera, the bag that they brought with them from village to village, sometimes welcomed, sometimes chased out. Antisthenes declares that virtue can be learned, albeit not through dialectics or the sciences. These activities are without value because one can only speak and think about a thing itself, as the Megarians acknowledge. This, quote, slow-witted old man, unquote, according to Plato's expression, this, quote, crude and silly person, unquote, according to Aristotle, despised mathematics and astronomy, declaring that, quote, those who had attained discretion had better not study literature lest they should be perverted by alien influences, unquote. Giving lessons for 4 or 5 minas like the sophists, he promised to educate his students about the path to happiness. He uses Homer's poems as a means of edification. In the Ion, Plato shows the arbitrariness and lack of seriousness in his exegeses. Nevertheless, cynicism can take any myth whatsoever as a basis for teaching because it is a question of the individual's formation. Virtue is in the acts, according to Antisthenes, and requires neither the various discourses nor the sciences. An act is not taught. One ends up acting due to exercise and training, which is where the importance of individual ascesis comes into play. The individual builds himself a stronghold. Prudence and intellectual virtue helps build this stronghold. It is a most sure stronghold which never crumbles away nor is betrayed. Walls of defense must be constructed in our own impregnable reasonings. Myth intervenes as a source of examples borrowed from life and the great acts of illustrious people. In this sense, the force of virtue does not pass from the idea to the individual, but from individual to individual. The titles of Antisthenes' works on morality are the following: Helen and Penelope, the Cyclops and Odysseus, Circes, Odysseus, Penelope, and the dog. The heroes emerge victorious from these ordeals. Hercules is the quintessential Cynic hero. He is the absolute individual, the type of unswerving willpower and complete freedom. Morality involves imitating Hercules or Diogenes because the Cynic plays a role of his very own that characterizes him as an individual. The image of the world considered as a theater wherein every man is an actor perhaps comes from Antisthenes' Archelaus. Little by little, the Cynics distinguish themselves due to their type of life. They are beggar sages completely untethered from any social group. According to Diogenes Laertius, the sage is a homeless exile to his country dead, a wanderer who begs for his daily bread. He has a vocation which is to be Zeus's messenger, responsible for observing the vices and errors of men. Diogenes declares to Philip that he is the observer of his insatiable desires. Menedemus, a contemporary of Philadelphus, dressed up as a fury and announced himself as one of Hades' observers responsible for reporting the sins of men to the demons. Antisthenes wrote a dialogue called On the Observer. Right, so with the Cynics, we have, even more than with the Megarians, this focus on the ethical. So they're not interested in metaphysics or science in general. They don't care about trying to develop an account of how the world works or what the world consists of, and so on. They're interested in living a sort of correct life, or living a life that is sort of virtuous in their particular way. And this has to do with being a true individual. So the social order is sort of rejected as something imposed on the individual, and the true life, or the correct life, is to live as this sort of wandering beggar, and just travel from city to city, and teach for a few coins, and just to earn a living, or just enough to avoid starvation, really, and just travel from one town to the next and sort of teach virtue as you go along. And so the Cynics had these, or some of the like key figures of the Cynical school were these sort of strange figures that rejected the social order, and especially in ancient Athens, or in ancient Greece as a whole, this was a very sort of surprising thing to do, where the whole sort of social set of principles would suggest that a political career and recognition of one's peers was sort of the key principle that you should use to guide your life. They rejected all of that and took their own path, and so they use these examples from Homer primarily, but from mythology in general, to sort of inculcate their understanding of the virtues, so that you should imitate Hercules or Odysseus or whatever other figure from Greek mythology. That should be your sort of guiding principle for your ethical life, and so they understand the what exactly you're imitating in their own terms. So in Hercules in particular, they find the sort of the model of someone who is an individual in the most complete sense. So someone who is not subordinated to any given social order and who just sort of does what he wants whenever he wants. And then there's also this other aspect of the role of the cynic sage, which is this observer of social life. So even though they sort of reject social life, at the same time, they have this role of sort of observing and commenting on social life. And in particular, they criticize the tyrants or the rulers of the various states within the Greek world. They criticize them for their insatiable desires. So these tyrants always want to conquer more or to have more wealth or more power, etc. And the Cynics criticize this sort of desire as being incompatible with virtue. Oh, and I should probably mention the word ascesis occurs in that passage somewhere. I can't remember exactly where. But anyway, so this has to do with the term aesthetic. So an ascetic is someone who sort of gives up their possessions or gives up their connection to the world in order to achieve some sort of higher intellectual or spiritual goal. And so in the case of the Cynics, they give up the pursuit of wealth and political power and social recognition. Instead, they focus on living virtuously as they understand that term. Yes, grad student life. Yeah, so let's go on to the next bit if someone else would like to read.
Yeah, okay.
Sorry, go ahead.
Diogenes of Sinope shows that the strength of the individual resides in exercise, ascesis. Quote, we see in the mechanical arts and the other arts how artisans acquire through exercise an extraordinary know-how, unquote, such as in athletes and flute players. Quote, nothing in life is successful without exercise. With it, one can overcome all things, unquote. Diogenes includes within exercise both manual and physical activity, as well as inner meditation. Ethical individualism is expressed by way of a complete trust in effort, a trust founded on experience, which by avoiding useless troubles allows for the choice of efforts in conformity with nature. Philosophy is useful for every individual. Its goal is the individual's happiness. It consists in, quote, choosing efforts in conformity with nature to be happy, unquote. This free individual, brimming with strength, sure of himself due to exercise, maintains customs and institutions with great contempt. He is able to critique the absurdity of the nomoi, laws, and the perspicacity of his critical mind allows him to free himself from all the conventional values of society. This critique does not seek to establish a better social order, but to free the individual from all constraint. The individual is able to make himself superior to social institutions because he understands them and knows how to parody them. Diogenes brags about helping his son, a banker and counterfeiter, falsify numismata, coins, thus proving his disdain toward all human institutions. This internal and individual reform consequently occurs on the margins of every social order without acting on this social order. The constant preoccupation with the totality of the order of simultaneity in Plato no longer exists for the Cynics. Moral life is separate from the social problem. At the same time, the knowledge of the universe produced by the exact sciences is cast aside as useless for the formation of judgment. Neither the social order nor the order of the cosmos are objects of preoccupation. The scientific spirit and the civic spirit do not serve to free the individual. The Cynic proclaims himself citizen of the world. His politics follow, quote, the laws of virtue more than those of the city, unquote. He seeks the least closed and least organized forms of political life that permit the itinerant individual the greatest freedom, like the Persian Empire or the Empire of Alexander. 3 of the works of Antisthenes bear the title Cyrus and perhaps inspired Xenophon's Cynopedia. Onesicrates, one of Diogenes' disciples, wrote a history of Alexander's education, which according to commentators imitates Xenophon's Cyropedia.
Right, so here we have more discussion of this ethical principle of individuality in the Cynics. So they they treat the goal of ethics as being happiness, and this happiness is understood in individual terms. So you should you should make choices based on sort of the natural order of things, as opposed to social conventions, the nomos. Um, so rather than sort of doing what the laws, the social conventions tell you you should do, you should follow your natural inclinations, um, and you should actually not just sort of ignore the laws, but you should actively subvert them, as Diogenes says with the counterfeiting. So you should try to undermine the social order, um, and the goal here is not sort of producing a better social order, but just individual happiness. It's sort of uh, uh, a counter order. It's a counter to the social order rather than sort of trying to develop a better social order. Um, let's see, what else do we have? Yeah, and so a sort of consequence of this understanding of the ethical life is that there's no longer any sort of concern for the structure of the city or the ideal state or anything like that, like we find in Plato. And what the Cynics, insofar as they give us something like a political doctrine, they're in favor of the openness of social orders. So they actually are in favor of the empire of Cyrus and of Alexander the Great. Um, they 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 favor these empires as opposed to the small city states because they want to have this openness. They want to have the capacity for the individual to sort of travel freely and wander around the the Greek worlds without obstacles. Yeah, and so there are these cynical authors that that just sort of write these admiring dialogues or texts about Cyrus the Great or about Alexander the Great, and their sort of empire building missions. Okay, let's go on to the Cyrenaics. If someone else would like to read.
I think it's my turn. I can read. The where Aristippus of, how do I pronounce Cyrene?
I would say Cyrene, but I don't know if that's right or not.
For Aristippus of Cyrene and his disciples, the individual is unleashed both from the weight of the exact sciences and from social organization. Along with the obligations that it brings, the life of society is so frustrating that only a madman will impose upon himself all the troubles and expenditures that these magistrates, quote, whom the cities use as their own slaves, unquote, must take on. The individual's purview is nothing but himself. He merely desires to lead an easy and agreeable life. For Aristippus, as well as for other hedonists, Eudoxus, for example, pleasure is the goal of possessions. This primordial obviousness should not be superposed with any rational perspective. It is necessary to trust in the immediate impression and appreciation given to each individual. This primacy of pleasure is opposed to wisdom, which is essentially stability, the invariance of thought and judgment amidst generational change and corruption, the possession of a stable and unfailing happiness, whereas pleasure is something fleeting and mobile. Aristippus considers this supposedly stable and unfailing happiness as the sum of all the pleasures of successive moments, just as for Eubulides a heap of wheat is nothing but the ensemble formed by the addition of all grains one by one, and just as a hairstyle is the sum of all the hairs taken one by one. For Aristippus the sage's happiness is not an ensemble that envelops all the successive moments in an absolute unity, but an open sequence formed by the successive addition of each moment. The notion of time is no longer the same as in Plato or Aristotle. Time is no longer the rhythm of the return of becoming back to itself at the end of the great year. It is no longer the measure of movement according to anterior and posterior. It is neither part of the circular becoming of the cosmos nor the activity of each individual. It is an open series without a predetermined coherence, a series that has no unity through which the whole governs the parts. because the parts are anterior to the whole, which is expressed by the successive arrival of ever new moments added to the preceding ones. The individual is the being for whom moments are added to moments and constitute life according to an additive process. Pleasure is pleasure in motion. Happiness is merely a result formed by the union of all the pleasures. The individual being is one for whom the moment exists because he is occupied by a painful moment or an easy moment, which is pain, or an easy moment, pleasure. Intellectual construction should not succeed in modifying the pleasure of the moment because they are, quote, a vain opinion. This is due to the fact that intellectual construction, instead of respecting the pleasure of the moment in its purity, unity, and unicity, creates an order of simultaneity that is superposed onto the order of succession. Suppose the problem of the combination of pleasures is, in fact, no longer to respect the successive nature of moments and to replace separate and autonomous moments with a superstructure that seeks to stabilize becoming, to fixate the moral being in becoming. Moreover, intellectual construction is uncertain, and only the impression given in the moment into the individual can be the object of an affirmation that would not be misleading. Quote, that we experience the impression of white or sweet is precisely what we can say in truth and certainty without lying, but that the cause of this impression is white and sweet is what cannot be asserted in particular. Knowledge remains purely individual. It does not make possible any harmony among men because it is strictly personal and because we cannot conclude from an experienced impression to that of one's. Language alone is held in common, but the same word designates different impressions in each individual. This sounds a lot like in the discussion of Heraclitus, where he talked about how you would have to sort of formulate a language that was adequate to expressing, something like pure becoming without any kind of like permanent stabilization. In the same way, the Cyrenaics seem to reject the possibility of saying anything stable about the sources of the impressions, which are always changing and kind of the only thing that's true.
Yeah, there's a certain similarity in the sense that they both have this idea that language sort of leads us to false statements. That so for the Heracliteans, we have this sort of tendency in language to assert stability, which is not real, and only becoming is real. But in any sort of statement that we make, we sort of falsely assert something stable. And then for the Cyrenaics, we have a similar sort of tendency in language to to pass from what is true and certain, which is the impressions, to the cause of those impressions, to asserting something about entities as opposed to just impressions. And so they both argue for a sort of reform of language or a different use of language that would not have this falseness inherent in it. The difference, though, I think, is that for the Cyrenaics, there's this notion of the impression or the order of impressions as being what is true and certain, as what we can have knowledge about. Whereas for the Heracliteans, there's no sort of realm of certain knowledge in the same way. There's only this constant becoming that we can never sort of fully grasp. There's no sort of depiction of an order of impressions or something along those lines that we can make true assertions about. So there is that difference as well. But yeah, so for the Cyrenaics, there's a sort of skepticism that sort of retreats from or considers any sort of intellectual construction or any intellectual activity to be something questionable. So what we can assert is just the fact that something seems sweet to me or something seems to be white. That is something that we can't be mistaken about. But as soon as we start asserting that something is white or something is sweet, then we're doing some sort of intellectual construction or intellectual activity, and then we are sort of opening ourselves up to error. And likewise, in the ethical realm, we should be concerned with particular states of pleasure. We have momentary states of pleasure, and the good life just consists in sort of stringing together as many of those moments of pleasure as possible. There's no sense in which something over and above the individual states is relevant to the good life. There's just this collection of states, or the sequence of states that sort of join together, and anything over and above that is just a sort of questionable intellectual construction. And this conception of the ethical life as having to do with a succession of moments of pleasure is a sort of common doctrine among various hedonistic schools. So schools that take pleasure to be the goal of ethical life, or of human life in general. So there's a sort of reduction of ethical life to simply this collection of moments of pleasure, and this is what is characteristic of hedonistic doctrines. Okay, so let's go on to the next section. I can read this bit. So we have a sort of transition, sort of outside of the linear order here. So just sort of explaining what the historical period consists in. Okay. Rejecting intellectual culture and civilization as a whole, uprooting himself from the order of simultaneity given by the city and the knowledge of the cosmos, man seeks a support in himself and in himself alone. At the same time, the structure of simultaneity that was justice or virtue, organizing the faculties of the soul and the relation of the different parts of the body wherein they have their respective center, is replaced by an order of pure succession, a pure succession of the moments of life added to one another without combining. The Hellenistic period is quite important for comprehending the implicit contents of our civilization. The Hellenic tradition is mixed together with Oriental contributions. Philosophy, above all, is addressed to the individual being on behalf of his salvation and to give him a rule for living. Theoretical reflection gives way to these practical preoccupations. The only theory is the one that remains necessary for founding the knowledge of the individual being, but this theory is already fully penetrated by an intention: to situate the individual being in his rapport to the natural world and the supernatural world, so that he better understands his destiny and can obtain salvation. The intention of the moral reform of the individual is upheld throughout all these elaborations of philosophical thought. This is why the individual seems like a being who is essentially one, who exists in time, and must preoccupy himself with the ordered series of his actions more than with his relation to society, to the world, or even with the knowledge of his internal structure. Starting with the 3rd century, the sciences are expulsed from philosophy and continue their autonomous life. The 3rd century before Jesus Christ is the century of Euclid, Archimedes, Apollonius of Perga, and Eratosthenes the geographer. Conversely, after the violent return of the individual to himself, inattention of effort or the enjoyment of the moment, which marks the thought of the end of the 4th century, philosophy no longer returns to the disinterested search for knowledge of the cosmos. The rupture between the theoretical and the practical, between the sciences and philosophy, will last until the Renaissance. Research concerning the nature of things will no longer have their end within themselves at the heart of philosophical thought. Knowledge of the cosmos is the principle of practice. He's describing this transition here in the Hellenistic period, where the individual is sort of understood in terms of an ethical principle, as opposed to something that is incorporated into the order of knowledge. So for Plato and for Aristotle, there's a sort of incorporation of the individual into the order of knowledge. So for Plato, you have the order of the cosmos and the ideal city, which sort of reflects the structure of the individual, and that's sort of cast aside by the different schools in the Hellenistic era. They instead focus on the ethical order and the individual's sort of progression through time, or the becoming of the individual, and that's the core of the doctrine of these Hellenistic schools. And which is not to say that there's no sort of theoretical philosophy for some of these schools. So we'll see with the Stoics and the Epicureans, they both have a theoretical philosophy that goes along with the ethical philosophy, but it's always subordinated in terms of its goals to that ethical philosophy. So you want to understand the world so that you can live a good life in that world, as opposed to trying to understand the world for its own sake. And so there's a sort of divergence between the sciences and philosophy at this point. Whereas for Plato, there's of course the famous inscription over the gates of the academy, which says that anyone who is ignorant of geometry is not allowed to enter. And so for Plato, there's a close connection between mathematics and philosophy. And Aristotle, of course, not so much mathematics, but he did extensive researches on animals that would today be described as biology. And he has a book on meteorology, and anyway, like a whole sort of system of science. But then for these later authors, there's a sort of split from the purely scientific tradition of Euclid and Archimedes and so on, and then the philosophical schools in the Hellenistic era. Okay, so let's go on to the Stoics, if someone else would like to read.
Thank you again. The Stoics. The Stoic school appears in a world in which the Greek cities are dominated by much vaster and more universal powers, those of Alexander's successors, who penetrate their influences into the most closed cities and bind them together, just like the Stoics' artistic fire penetrates and subtends all parts of the world. Amidst the reversals and changes of constitution that follow, a new permanence of becoming, a background of cosmic power, is able to arrive on the scene. The abrupt dislocation of the Greek cities in the age of Macedonian conquests freed the individual, who no longer sought support except in himself or in the examples of heroes. In the 3rd century, the individual no longer seeks this absolute independence. He once again seeks to incorporate himself into an order that surpasses him. But this order is no longer sought in the city and in the stability of its laws and institutions. The Stoic finds the foundation of personal ethics in the cosmic order grasped as a dynamism, a law of becoming. The notion of a role to be played is substituted for the notion of place. Place integrates the individual into the order of simultaneity, whereas the role inserts him into the order of universal becoming. As E. Brehier has noted, the first Stoic philosophers are not Greek citizens. They come from countries on the fringes of Hellenism, situated outside the great civic and pan-Hellenic tradition, subjected to the influences of the Semitic peoples. Zeno is from Citium, a city of Cyprus, and Chrysippus was born in the city of Tarsus, or Soli, in Cilicia. Herolas of Carthage and Bethus of Sidon come from countries that are Semitic, properly speaking. Later, Diogenes of Babylon and Apollodorus of Seleucia will come from Chaldea. Only Clynthus, Spherus of Bosphorus, and Dionysius of Heraclea come from Hellenized countries. However, the necessity of voyages and commerce turned these villages into sites of passage more so than the closed cities, who were aware of the strength of their traditions and the stability of their institutions. Their inhabitants were prepared to venture into every country without being preoccupied with local affairs. Their universe extended to the limits of the known world. The relation of the individual to the cosmos does not pass through any sort of mediation like the city. The Stoic is called upon directly to insert himself into the becoming of the world. The Stoic feels that he is more so a voluntary friend of a successor, who founds an extensive state than the citizen of a Greek village. Like the Cynics, they admire the kings of Macedonia. The kings, moreover, sense the strength and novelty of this philosophy that is commensurate with the foundation of an empire. They ply the Stoics with flattery and lavish them with abundant remunerations. Antigonus Ilgonatus, hoping I get that right, is an admirer of Zeno and Clynthus. He attends their lectures. With Zeno's death, he calls upon the city of Athens to build a tomb in Zeno's honor in the Kerameikos. Yet this bond is not fortuitous. It is something more than the product of a simple calculation by vocation. Stoicism is the philosophy of a self-founding empire, i.e. the power of an individual man who depends neither on tradition nor the laws to establish an order that extends into a multitude of cities and peoples with their various constitutions and different languages. This man is no longer the defender of the stability of a city or a constitution, because his role is to change the face of the world. His work has a meaning in time through its dynamism, not in the order of simultaneity that produces the stability of a city.
Right. So here we have the transition, or the new sort of social order, or the new society of the Hellenistic era is no longer made up of these city-states, these independent city-states. Instead, you have these empires, or these large kingdoms that succeed to Alexander's empire. And in particular, you have the Greek world is incorporated into the broader Mediterranean world and comes into contact in more significant ways with other peoples. So here he refers to the Semitic peoples. So there's sort of an intermingling of different ethnic and linguistic groups in these kingdoms in a way that wasn't the case with some of the with the Greek city-states of the earlier era. And so the Stoics, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, they are the ones who invent the term cosmopolitan, which means inhabitant of the universe or inhabitant of the world. So a Stoic is not someone who is essentially loyal or sort of oriented towards their own particular city that they happen to have been born in. They're oriented; they're citizens of the world. They have a universal orientation, and so the significance of the non-Greek origin of some of the early Stoic philosophers is that they are not necessarily loyal to any particular Greek city-state. They have this sort of externality to the political order. They're not incorporated into the order of any existing city-state, and this makes them sort of ready to accept these universal or these kingdoms that have a universal ambition, that want to be universal kingdoms that govern the whole known world. And so because of this, they tend to have much closer relations with the rulers of these kingdoms, and so there's like a sort of reciprocity between the rulers of the kingdoms and the Stoic philosophers. The philosophers admire the rulers of these kingdoms for their role in creating these sort of universal realms, and then the rulers of these realms admire the philosophers for basically extolling their own rule. We'll get into more of the content of the Stoic doctrine, but in general, there's this sort of dynamism, as Simondon calls it. So there's, instead of trying to sort of define an order of simultaneity, or to incorporate the individual into an order of simultaneity, what is valued or what is sought after is this internal dynamism of the individual. So the individual's capacity to bring about change in the social order. And so this is why someone like Alexander is valued as sort of a model for the Stoics, someone who transforms the whole social order of the known world, of the Greek world. So this is sort of the orientation of the Stoics, this dynamic orientation of the Stoics. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I can read. The importance of cosmic dynamism appears in Zeno, who wanted to read the ancients and who found in Heraclitus' thought a physical theory that could serve as a starting point for his meditation. An ample vision of the universe truly dominates primitive Stoicism. The medical schools that existed before Plato and Aristotle also presented a dynamistic theory, not of the cosmos, but of the living individual. Health is constituted by the equilibrium of four forces, i.e. the humors of yellow bile, black bile, acid phlegm, and salty phlegm. Following Galen, Zeno was adept in this doctrine and founded a medical school himself, that of the Methodicals. According to this school, disequilibrium among the humors stems either from the excess or lack of one of the humors, or from a disruption in the continuity of the parts of the body. The living individual is therefore the unity of a whole, constituted by forces that counterbalance one another. In the 4th century, Diogenes of Carystus, a physician who adheres to this physiological theory, thinks that every phenomenon of animal life is regulated by hot and cold, dryness and humidity, and that there is an innate heat whose alteration of integrated nourishment produces the four humors: yellow bile, black bile, acid phlegm, salty phlegm, the proportions of which explain health and sickness. Moreover, the external air, which is attracted toward the heart through the larynx, the esophagus, and the pores, becomes in the heart the psychical breath within which the intelligence resides and which expands throughout the body by providing it with tension and activity, which give rise to voluntary movements. This fire is the potency that animates the body. This potency circulates in the blood vessels. Sickness occurs due to the accumulation of humors that prevent this potency from passing. This conception of the physiological individual is eminently dynamistic. The role of the activity that establishes communication and maintains life has been relegated to a material, or rather energetic soul, i.e. a soul of fire. The static structure of the body is not what explains and produces life. Instead, vital activity is what radiates throughout the body in order to animate it. According to Diogenes of Carystus, the Stoics considered the whole world to be an immense individual organized in the manner of a living being. The pneuma, breath, of the cosmos penetrates everything, just as the fire of the soul of a particular body penetrates every organ, thereby subtending it and animating it. Stone and iron are different degrees of this tonos, tension of igneous breath that suffuses all beings, suffuses all things. All active functions are concentrated in this fire known as seed fire, creative and artistic fire. Potency is the principle of form, and the reason for this or that state is the igneous breath that sculpts particular beings. What reappears here is the second aspect of physis, that of productive dynamism, which is something that was left out by Plato and Aristotle but was conserved by the medical schools. The Stoics also benefited from the works of the Pythagoreans, who established the mathematical laws of harmony and understood the law of acoustics, which links the length of the vibrating cord, its weight per unit of length, and its tension to the pitch of its emission. Furthermore, phenomena of resonance become the object of experiments, which was possible due to the mathematical foundation provided by the discoveries of the Pythagoreans. Nevertheless, resonance far surpasses the framework of the experiments of acoustics in extension and generality. It shows that the exchange of energy between two bodies depends not just on the proximity or distance between the two bodies, but also and essentially, when it is a question of two elastic bodies and a vibratory energy, on the degree of tension of these two bodies, which defines for each of these bodies, relative to their dimensions and mass, a frequency of resonance that is also a frequency of oscillation proper when each body is submitted to a vibration. The exchange of energy between these two bodies remains quite low when the frequencies proper are not equal to or multiples of one another. On the other hand, when the frequencies are equal, the exchange of energy becomes so significant that the phenomenon of resonance seems to be the evocation of a spontaneous activity within the resonator, whereas it draws all its energy from the oscillator. However, for experimenters, what was particularly striking in the study of resonance was the possibility of establishing or interrupting the coupling between two bodies, not through the interposition of a screen or by distancing them from one another, but by acting solely on the internal tension of the resonator or oscillator to bring the two vibrating bodies into resonance. Resonance is called syntonia, i.e. equality of pitch and also equality of tension, for the pitch is most easily varied by modifying the tension. This surprising phenomenon, although quite easy to realize and perfectly rationalizable because it follows from the rapport of numbers, is for the Stoics not just the principle of the dynamic organization of the living individual, like man, and the principle of the organization of this immense individual that the world is, but also the principle of the dynamic relation between microcosm and macrocosm. The coherence and unity of the microcosm and macrocosm depend on syntonia. Illness is a lack of tension that forces an organ to no longer participate in the ensemble due to its disharmony. Thought itself is tonos. It is the tension to the object it wants to grasp. Attention is a tension of the mind that allows it to become syntonic with the object it wants to think. Mind and object are thereby in harmony. The order of the world is a cyclical movement with a determined frequency. In the individual microcosm, wisdom is the realization of syntony with the rhythm of the universe. The contradictions between individual freedom and determinism disappear because a resonator resonates precisely on the frequency that would be its own if it emitted free oscillation. So here we see some of the physics of the Stoic school, which is actually quite interesting. The whole Stoic physics is something that is still sort of an object of study today, as there's a doctrine of the mixtures. So there are sort of mixtures of entities that allow for this interpenetration of entities, in particular this fire that penetrates everything. So Simondon draws the connection from the Stoics back to the medical schools and ultimately back to Heraclitus. So there's this continuity from Heraclitus to these medical schools who taught that sickness and health consist in different ratios of the four humors, and so there's a sort of dynamism to this in the sense that there's these ratios are sort of self perpetuating. So if the ratio of your humors is off balance, then that ratio will tend to continue to be off balance unless there's some sort of external intervention by the doctor. And there's this notion of the pneuma, the breath, that sort of penetrates the whole cosmos and acts as this sort of animating spirit. It corresponds to the soul of an individual entity, a living being, but it organizes and sort of dynamizes the whole universe. It brings about the transformation of entities within the universe. And there's the other sort of strand that Simondon describes in the Stoic physics has to do with the Pythagorean doctrine of music. And so the Pythagoreans were the first ones who discovered the relationship between musical tones and ratios of lengths of strings, for example, or lengths of a wind instrument. So the different musical notes can be described in terms of ratios of lengths of string to each other. Like the octave is half of a length of string, for example. This mathematical doctrine of the of ratios, or of understanding the world in terms of ratios of quantities, is something that the Stoics drew from the Pythagoreans, but they have this doctrine of resonance of entities. So entities have their own sort of frequency that they resonate at, so the entities have their own resonating frequency, but they also have this capacity to resonate in harmony with other entities. And this is what knowledge consists in. It's a kind of harmony of resonance between the knower and the object known. There's also this doctrine that sort of tries to overcome the opposition between determinism and freedom in accordance with this notion of resonance. So because each entity has its own frequency of resonance, its own sort of way of cyclical repetition, it means that the external world or the other entities that bring about transformations always elicit that same internal frequency of the entity. So there's no sort of opposition between being caused by something without and being the source of action, because in either case the action consists in this sort of internal resonance. And so this is an attempt to overcome this opposition between freedom and determinism. And so the Stoic ethics, as we'll see as we continue here, is a sort of subordination to necessity, but subordination is not the right word, because we sort of find our true freedom in grasping the necessity of the world and sort of inserting ourselves into that necessity. And so we have this sort of resonance in harmony with the world. And then in this case, when we achieve this resonance, we no longer have this opposition between the world around us and our own freedom. They sort of harmonize with each other. Okay, let's go on to the next bit from However, this theory.
I can read again. However, this theory, which is so seductive, it has been reprised in so many forms, presents an internal fault that was only partially accounted for by the Stoics. In order for the possibility of establishing resonance between microcosmic individual and macrocosmic individual, microcosm and macrocosm must be the seat of a recurrent activity for one another. Yet such a condition, if it leaves freedom and determinism to the individual being, nevertheless supposes that this being does not advance in time and always acts in the same way. The activity of the sage cannot be conceived as anything but a perpetual iteration. The brute order of the universe, however, does not always offer the aspect of a profound and essential regularity of events. This regularity must also be hidden and revealed for the eyes of the sage alone. The rhythm of the universe is what the providential will of God, immanent to the universe and reigning over all its infinite wisdom, wills. The universe is known by way of a physics fulfilled in theology. This God is not incorporeal. It is active body, possessing the characteristics that today we will attribute to what we call energy. It is moved mover and is immanent to the thing that undergoes its action, to the matter that passes under action, just as incense expands in air and wine suffuses the mass of water, however large, with which it is mixed. A new physics takes shape with the Stoics, that of the total mixture. The Platonic conception of the elements formed by regular tetrahedrons, which were themselves constituted by elementary triangles, as well as Aristotelian conception of the proper place, gave a real impenetrability to each body. The body could not be anything other than what it was. Moreover, mechanistic geometrism leads to a representation of the homogeneity of things. In Plato, all elementary triangles are similar, just like the tetrahedrons of each element. Conversely, the Stoics adopt a representation of singular bodies that is quite different and is closer to that of Anaxagoras' theory of homo eomerius. A body can be constituted by a mixture that is absolutely homogeneous and continuous in unspecified proportions for an unspecified number of fundamental elements. Two bodies can unite by mixing via juxtaposition, just as different types of grain are mixed, or by conflating the two into one, as an alloying of metals. But they can also mix together in a total mixture in such a way that, without losing their substance and their properties, they expand throughout one another, which results in the fact that these two bodies are found in any portion whatsoever of their shared space. There is no impenetrability. Aristotle, on the contrary, supposed that too small a proportion of one of the constituents of a mixture or alloy leads to the disappearance of that proportion of components, which was consequently in a state of inferiority. A small amount of tin added to bronze, which Aristotle no doubt considered a pure metal, does not modify its characteristics and only changes its color. In this sense, the agent expands through the patient, the soul throughout the body, the logos throughout matter. Should I stop there?
Yeah, we can stop there because this is another multi-page paragraph. So this is more discussion of the Stoic physics and this notion of mixture. So this is the true sense of mixture for the Stoics is one in which two bodies completely suffuse each other. So they oppose this to like the example here of different kinds of grain mixed together. So if you take a bucket of wheat and a bucket of barley and you mix them together, each grain of wheat and each grain of barley are still the same as they were, but the bucket is just sort of a mix together of wheat and barley. But if you take wine and pour it into water, or vice versa, the wine and water are mixed together in such a way that every portion of the vessel it contains both wine and water. So the two bodies are completely suffused with each other. There's no sort of particles of wine and particles of water that are independent of each other. And so this doctrine of mixtures means that bodies are not impenetrable in the way that they were for Aristotle. So that it doesn't make sense to say that a body has a sort of defined place in which it's bounded by the other bodies. The bodies all sort of penetrate each other, and everything is a kind of mixture of different bodies that are interpenetrating. And we'll see more on some of the consequences of this doctrine in a little bit. But there's also, going back a little bit, there's this notion of God as a body that sort of organizes the universe. So the Stoics generally use the term Zeus, which is obviously drawn from Greek religious thought, but they give it a sort of almost impersonal meaning. But Zeus is the sort of providential governance of the world. So the world is organized in such a way that there are these natural cycles and natural ratios and the sort of resonating frequencies of different entities that are in harmony with each other. And that's what Zeus consists in, is precisely that ordering of the universe. But it's important also that this ordering of the universe is not something incorporeal or spiritual or something outside of the natural worlds in the way that we maybe today would think of what a divine entity would be. It's a sort of, it's immanent in the world. It's just the order itself. It's not something that sort of brings about the ordering or institutes the ordering. It's the order of the universe itself is what Zeus is. And so in this sense, God is not incorporeal. God is actually a body that penetrates the whole universe in the same way that wine is mixed into water. Let's see. I think we have time for probably one more reading. If someone else would like to read from each singular body.
Yeah, I can go again. Each singular body, therefore, owes its individuality neither to its internal geometrical structure nor to its place in the order of simultaneity of beings, but instead to the proper mixture that characterizes it. It is idiosyncrasy in the proper sense of the term, the temporal series of the influences, also in the proper sense, that it has undergone is within it as constitutive of its idiosyncrasy. Its entire past existence is really contained in it materially, or at least corporeally. To know what a singular being is, one must know the series of the successive instants of its existence in time, or at least the drama of the successive passions that have influenced it. Since this succession of passions is different for each being, the individuality of a being is constituted by its singularity. There is indeed a proper quality of each being, its idioma, that corresponds to the idiosyncrasy. This proper and somewhat personal quality always distinguishes one being from every other being. This quality allows fantasia to be fantasia catalepticae, comprehensive representation, i.e., according to Zeno, quote, the representation imprinted in the soul based on a real object and in conformity with this real object, such that it would not exist if it did not come from a real object, unquote. This comprehensive representation produces true perception with the same necessity that a weight lowers the tray of a scale. Knowledge is this relation of an object, which is real and recognized as real due to its individual singularity, to a subject that is equally real and individual. In this theory, no matter what may constitute knowledge, relation has the value of being, for it is solely corporeal, and it modifies terms materially. It is not a simple rapport. It is definitively inscribed in the terms by becoming an integral part of their idiosyncrasy. Intellectual elaboration can only consist in the act of grasping the sensible object. One can only abstract, add, compose, transpose, while never getting out of sensible givens. The propositions obtained in this way do not express a rapport between concepts, Their subject is always singular, and the attribute is always a verb, i.e. something that happens to the subject. The matter of dialectics consists in the stated facts of singular subjects. The syllogism is a rapport between facts, each of which is expressed by a simple proposition, and the rapport of which is expressed by a composite judgment. The logical bond is always expressed as a bond observed between facts and stated by language. This notion of fact, which governs the entirety of Stoic philosophy, is extremely important for the conception of the individual. The individual is the being that results from a series of facts organized into a drama. There is no longer a distinction between substance and accidents in the individual. The being is what it is, or rather, it is what it has been. The fact of being what it was no longer refers to a permanent quiddity, but to the novelty of an indefinite drama. The individual is the being that is constituted by a singular drama and accumulates within itself, in its idiosyncrasy, the substance of all these events, all these relations that transform into being because they are corporeal.
Yeah, we can stop here. So this doctrine of these corporeal relations, or these interpenetration of bodies, is or bears on this notion of the reality of relation, which is sort of a key doctrine for Simondon, as we saw in Volume 1. That Simondon wants to have an understanding of relation as having the status of being, as opposed to being something external to what things are. And so for the Stoics, relation in the true sense of the term is always a body, or always some sort of corporeal interpenetration of two bodies. It's not just a sort of logical relation between two entities that are external to each other. And so there's this this notion of the fantasia, the impressions that entities make on us, which is not just a sort of representation, or a sort of an intellectual depiction of entities, but it's actually an interpenetration of entities. So the thing that we perceive is actually emitting something that penetrates our body, and that's how we perceive it. And this perception is something that is we don't have to sort of worry about the possibility of knowledge of entities that are depicted by the senses, because this is a real relation, a real interpenetration of the other entity and our body. So there's a sort of overcoming of skepticism, or a non-interest in skepticism in the Stoic physics. The physics sort of provides a foundation for a non-skeptical theory of knowledge. And then there's this notion of the life history of the individual, or this notion of drama that Simondon uses here, or alludes to here. So there's a sort of singularity of beings. Entities have their own life history, whether living entities, or a stone, or a statue, or whatever it is. They have a sort of singularity in the sense that they're the product of a particular coming together of various bodies that form this individual, and so there's this life history is something that is an order of becoming that is not subordinated to an order of simultaneity. So it's not that the acorn becomes an oak tree because of an essence that, or a form of the oak tree that is contained in it, in the way that Aristotle would have described it. Instead, the becoming of the acorn into an oak tree is sort of a contingent, or sorry, not contingent, but is this particular life history that this oak tree in front of me has, this particular oak tree. So each oak tree has its own singular life history, and this is what sort of constitutes the entity as what it is now, as opposed to some sort of form or essence that would be defined at one moment. It's that entire life history that defines the oak tree. Okay, so I think maybe this is a good place to pause, and then next time we will start talking more about the Stoic ethics, and we'll get through the Stoic ethics, and then we'll look at the Epicurean school, which is the other sort of major school of the late Hellenistic era.
Sounds good to me.
Sounds great.
Okay, so thank you everyone for coming out and for your contributions, and hope to see you next week.